Gallery Director and Curator at the Hampshire College Art Gallery. I'm delighted to have worked with contemporary artist Pablo Delano on our new exhibition, The Museum of the Old Colony. Through enlarged and carefully sequenced reproductions of original materials, Delano creates a conceptual art installation that takes the form of a museum. And we're going to be talking a bit about that today. But first, let me introduce him. So Pablo Delano is a visual artist and photographer born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, who currently lives in Hartford, Connecticut, where he teaches studio art and serves as co-director of the Center for Caribbean Studies at Trinity College. His work has been exhibited all over in museums and galleries across the US, Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, and of course now at Hampshire College Art Gallery. So Pablo, thank you so much for being here and speaking to us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So the first thing I really want to talk about, thinking about the Museum of the Old Colony project and when viewers enter the space, is that the first thing they see is a row of cans and bottles in a kind of glass case. Can you tell us what that's all about?
Yes, it's true. You enter the gallery and you see a glass case filled with some rusty cans and old bottles, and the viewer might wonder why. If you look closer, you'll see that all of these cans and bottles come from a beverage, and the brand name of that beverage is Old Colony. Now, Old Colony was a very popular brand of soft drink that was sold across the United States and somehow made its way to Puerto Rico in the 1940s, and it turns out that that's the only place in the world that I know of where it's actually still made and marketed under that name, Old Colony. There are two flavors, grape and pineapple, and to me this was a terribly ironic reality because the island where this drink is the only place in the world where this drink is still manufactured and still made is regarded by many people as the oldest still existing colony in the world.
So for you then, this material culture object, this soda brand became a way of thinking about the oldest colony in the world, and you created an exhibition around this. Can you tell us a little bit about how that museum formed, and particularly the role of photography in being part of that colonial project? Because it seems like photography is really at the core of the Museum of the Old Colony.
Sure. Of course, the exhibit itself does not contain any more bottles or cans. So this is your introduction, and the idea for the project is framed by this crazy idea, this crazy notion, that there is this beverage that's still sold, and it's called the museum. It's called Old Colony. Right, but as you proceed into the gallery, you see sequences of large photographs, ranging from images that were created in 1898 up until even the 1980s. So there's groupings of photographs, large walls full of photographs, and none of them are the actual original photographs. In fact, they're scans and large reproductions. They're printed quite large, and I believe that by doing so, the impact of the image is quite strong. In 1898, when the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico, the idea was to set up a colonial government, and along with the troops, the U.S. sent photographers, experts, writers, and they produced an enormous number of images and books which were meant for distribution in the mainland United States, and were meant not just to document and show what was happening in America's new colonies or America's new possessions, which also included other islands, Cuba, Hawaii, Philippines, Guam, but also to sell the idea that this was somehow good and beneficial to the United States, and that the United States would be somehow lifting this so-called primitive place up, bringing improvements, and otherwise carrying out good deeds. Photography was particularly important in this mission because it was seen as the truth, an unmediated kind of truth If it was photographed and you could see it in a picture, it must be true. And out of that comes the cliche, photographs don't lie. Of course, we know that photographs lie, and it was known then that photographs were perfectly capable of lying. But the idea that photographs somehow represented the truth was much more generally accepted then than today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we might see photography quite differently today, and yet it's important to cast ourselves back to a time in which it had a kind of evidentiary function, which really powerfully buttressed that colonial gaze and that construction for a US audience. But something I found really interesting about the images is that they are able to tell many stories and operate in many different ways. And for me, one of the most powerful is that they seem to become time-traveling objects, where, for example, I was looking at an image of a traveling roadshow for the benefits of widespread electrification in the 1950s and how it was going to make life and work so much easier. And there's something really curious and really ironic about seeing that image from the vantage point of the longest blackout in US history. Of course, today we just read that perhaps the final household has had electricity restored in Puerto Rico, but we still have an inherently unstable power grid. So these images, even though they're historic images that you've collected over time, reproduced and represented in the form of this museum, they cast us back into the present, back and forth between past and present, and make them speak to each other. So how do you feel those historical images make us think about the urgencies and pressing issues of the present?
Well, I think it's very relevant, and I think that viewers who experience this art installation perceive that. We keep using the word museum, and I think it's important to dwell on that. So this is obviously not a brick and mortar museum. It's an exhibit that's named after the idea. It's more the concept of a museum. And so I created the whole installation, or the concept of the piece, based also on this notion of the role that museums have had in our society. Museums haven't been around that long, really, when you think about it. A few centuries, perhaps, right? And museums have always had an agenda behind them, a curatorial point of view, a purpose. In fact, there are many museums which in the past have served to justify empire, to justify the dominance of some people by other people. That plays into your question a little bit, in the sense that, for example, you have the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, which actually had live human beings on display. Very, very degrading, right? And you think about this colonial experiment that the United States implemented in 1898 and is still carrying on to some degree, right? And so I think that's where the relevance is. And people look at these pictures, and as you said, they see the connection between the urging to electrify and modernize, and the situation which we're in today, where the electrical grid is in shambles, where you see perhaps a growth and an expansion of a so-called middle class in the 1950s, things getting better and better for a while, and then where we're at today, which is, again, a really chaotic situation where the colonial power, which was supposed to bring so much good, denies aid to people who have been through a catastrophe. So I think those connections are pretty strong. There's another issue, which is that in the last few years, especially since this current administration, questions of race have become very prominent in this country. Supporters of white power, white supremacists have felt emboldened. And it's really interesting to look back at some of these early images and see how racialized, what a racialized view the US brought to this island, which was formerly a colony, but formerly a Spanish colony. I'm not saying that there wasn't racism or race issues under the Spanish government, but under the US government, it became very, very overt. So you see in the texts and captions of these photographs continual, constant references to the color of people.
Yeah, and I think that's really prominent also, given the US is obviously history with slavery, and there's almost a discourse and a way of representing others that is a carryover from that, which becomes naturalized and then cast onto the interaction with Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, and draws you back into the story also of slavery in the Caribbean. So there's so many of these intersecting histories that influence both how people were being seen, how they were being portrayed, and then how they were being viewed and circulated at the time, and of course now, with these different visual registers and histories. I was interested in your unpacking the idea of the museum as well, because something that's significant about this exhibition is not just that there are a number of individual images that are incredibly powerful, can tell many stories, can be unpacked, have often very complex captions, but they don't just work as singular images. They're part of careful sequencing, of groupings, of thinking about space as you move through the gallery. And that's a very curatorial act. So it's not only a critique of the museum itself, but it's kind of a museological process. So can you tell us a little bit about that, your kind of role as a curator of this museum too?
Sure. Well, my career as a visual artist the medium that I've mostly worked in is photography. In other words, working behind a camera and actually shooting photographs, making photographs. This is new in a way. I'm trained as a painter, so it's not something that's completely foreign to me, the idea of working with visual images and arranging and rearranging. But I think it's worth noting that none of the photographs that are in this installation are of my authorship. They're all appropriated from historical sources and identified so that it's very clear. Within that, then the artistry, if you can use that term, or the curatorial approach is specifically what you mentioned, this idea of what you put next to each other, how you contextualize, how you build these sequences, how you group the images in a way that the meaning becomes greater than that of any individual image, so that themes reinforce themselves and echo each other, maybe through different time periods, for example. One example is the way that these images depict the image of the jíbaro. The jíbaro is the definition of the word as it's used in Spanish in Puerto Rico is as a countryman, a farmer, someone who is a person who lives off the land, usually in the mountains, usually associated with agriculture, farming, cane cutting, or raising tobacco. Usually lives in quite a simple shack. There are certain forms of dress that are associated, a certain hat that's associated, known as a pava. And it's a word that has positive connotations. People are proud of our jíbaro because he is the strong, hardworking countryman with dignity, et cetera, et cetera. It also has some negative connotations in the same way that sometimes in English you might refer to a hick, a country hick, or an ignorant person. Mostly it has positive connotations, but I don't want to disregard the negative connotations. So this was a concept that the U.S. Authorities became very aware of when they arrived, the word jíbaro and the jíbaro people. And it's very interesting to see through not just one image, but many images, the way that this type, if you can use that word, it's a very problematic term, right? But type or stereotype is depicted, throughout these images, ranging from 1898 up until much more recently. And so as you walk through the exhibit, you'll notice references to the jíbaro, you'll notice images of jíbaros in both positive and negative terms, mostly disparaging terms.
So that idea of type also that you brought up with all its possible valences, it brings me to what I think is really an important question or complexity that's carried in this exhibition, and that's that many of these historical images contain stereotypes, many of them are racist. And yet the project as a whole, the construction of a museum that reflects on this, is a deeply anti-racist, anti-colonial project. Can you talk a little bit about that push and pull and how the viewer needs to be active in constructing meaning?
Even though the project began before the two hurricanes, Irma and especially Maria, which completely devastated the island, it's even more relevant now. And I think the question becomes more important now that we're living in a post-Maria world where the island was basically destroyed, because the question then becomes, if the U.S. took over this place in 1898 with the idea of improving it, what has become of that? And we see today, right, in 2018, a complete lack of sort of help that one might expect, and so you have the U.S. president coming and disparaging, insulting people by throwing paper towels at them, I'm sorry,
thinking about the push and pull between the
right,
kind of
right.
anti-racist
Right,
role
right, right.
of the exhibition.
Right. So I think it's
yeah.
important. It's important for people to see as they consider what kind of relationship this island is going to have with this place, this large country that invaded in 1898. As we consider the future, it's a very political island. There are basically there are various ideas for the future, what might happen. One of them might be statehood. Many people believe that somehow statehood would bring an end to the colonial status, to be a U.S. state like Hawaii or Alaska. Another alternative might be full independence, where the island becomes self-governing and a sovereign state. And the third possibility, which can be broken down into many subsets, is some version of what exists now, which was basically was referred to as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It started in 1952, which is neither one. It's sort of an in-between. It's sort of an in-between state. So why look at these images? And as you said, some of them are very hurtful and very, very tough and hard to swallow. I think because I think it helps us consider, and it helps us ask questions about where we might want to go. When the New York Times did a piece about this project, one of the people who commented on the New York Times piece said, "Oh, it's such a shame that we were referred to in such disparaging terms. It's too bad, but we really have to be very grateful for what the United States has done for us." I hope that my exhibit provokes people to consider that question. Do we have to be grateful? Are we in a place of gratitude, or are we in a place of disgust and of thinking, no, this is enough? The exhibit deliberately does not propose a solution. There's built-in ambiguity. People can look at it and come away with different readings. I'm just hoping it asks a lot of questions, and it provokes people to ponder what the future might be. Remember that this is a place, I use that word instead of territory or nation, or this is a place that has not been self-governing since the arrival of Columbus in 1493. So it's never been a self-governing entity. It's always been under the rule of outsiders since 1493. And so what's the next step? That's what I'm hoping the image will, that's what I'm hoping the exhibit will help people sort out for themselves. And people can come to very different conclusions.
Yeah, certainly that's something that I've found, is that really the most provocative, the most significant art is not that which answers all the questions, but poses or brings to the fore the most important questions. And another thing we're really excited about, that I'd love to tell people about, is that the exhibit becomes a hub that also will facilitate a lot of extensive programming, and that the programming will help us tease out some of these issues. So do follow along with our website and Facebook page to find out more about some of the programs that we'll be running that will extend and expand these conversations, push back at some of the images, some of the issues at play in the exhibition. And two things to highlight specifically are our official opening, launch and reception on Thursday, September the 20th from 5 to 7. And then the following Thursday, the 27th, we'll be having Pablo to give us a talk about his own personal connection and the evolution of this project over time. That I think will set up a really good backdrop for understanding what's going on in the exhibition from the artist's perspective, and there'll be an opportunity there for Q&A as well. And those are just two of the many programs we'll be running through September, October, and midway into November. So do stay tuned, there'll be lots of exciting opportunities. One thing that has already occurred, which I think speaks to the way in which this exhibition potentially reaches people, starts new stories, and engages new imaginings, is the work of Magdalena Gomez, who has been writing a series of poetic responses to the images and this exhibition as a whole. So we're going to close today with one of those poetic responses, and we do hope that we'll be able to share more with you in the future.
Mister, so much white must cause many problems. When you eat, when you fall, when you cheat on your spouse with someone who wears lipstick. When a breeze blows sand mixed with bolquerias and cigarette butts left by tourists that stick to everything. Newspaper ink when you are reading. When you sit on a dusty chair or beneath a tree. The stain of grass will never leave you. My gourd is full of seeds. You can make music and be happy again. If you should spill beer or wine or blood. You can drink from my gourd. You can eat from my gourd. Don't you think it's beautiful?